For one thing, it wasn't on the map. Legend had placed Troy on the Dardanelles, near the coast of present-day Turkey, but no ruins identified the great city. It was as if the site of the Trojan War, the greatest war story ever told, had never existed. But for thousands of years, people had repeated Homer's tale. How Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships, had been taken away to Troy. How the Greeks had battled for 10 long years to get her back, led by the great king Agamemnon. How the war was finally won with a wooden horse full of soldiers. In Homer's tale, the Greeks destroyed the great city of Troy, burning it to the ground.
Schliemann was just captured by the Iliad. The descriptions of what goes on, everything about the human condition is found in the Iliad in a very poetic and magnificent manner. And the idea of finding the site where all of these great tensions between love and strife, between divine and human interaction were worked out, was something that just swallowed him up.
With his copy of Homer as a guide, Schliemann examined the mound thought to be the likeliest location of Troy. In the Iliad, 2 springs mark the foot of the great city's hill. To his dismay, Schliemann found many more here. And trial excavations turned up nothing but dirt. But just as he was about to leave the area, the German got lucky. He met an Englishman named Frank Calvert, who owned another mound, the site of many prior civilizations. Calvert believed his mound held the real Troy, far beneath the surface.
Frank Calvert explained to Schliemann that he had done some excavations there, which took him down below the Greek and Roman levels into deep deposits which were earlier. So he said there is a very good chance that in these deep earlier deposits you will find the Troy of the Trojan War. And that convinced Schliemann, and it gave him something to do.
But Schliemann didn't have a clue how to begin.
Dear Mr. Calvert, have I to take a tent and iron bedstead and pillow with me? What sort of hat is best against the scorching sun? Please give me an exact statement of all the implements of whatever kind and of all the necessaries which you advise me to take with me.
With Calvert's encouragement, Schliemann began digging in earnest in October 1871. On the first day, he hired 8 men. By day 3, there were 80. Caution was not his style. Assuming Homer's Troy lay at the bottom of the mound, Schliemann had his men dig a great gash right through the center of it.
One must plunge immediately into the depths. Only then will one find things.
On their way down, the men uncovered not one city, but many of them. But Schliemann didn't let these other Troys get in his way.
You can see when he began that his methods were very, very crude. He was going in with winches and crowbars and battering rams. The horrifying tale is spelt out in some of his writings. And nowadays one just blenches at the thought of it.
The numbers of immense blocks of stone, which we continually come upon, cause great trouble and have to be got out and removed. All of my work went hurried to see the enormous weight roll down and settle itself at some distance in the plain.
Schliemann was discarding priceless relics from thousands of years of civilization on the site. Thankfully, rains closed the season early. But the next year, he was back. This time, attacking the mound with 150 men under the command of a railroad engineer. Often by Schliemann's side, was his new Greek wife, Sophia, who won his heart by reciting from the Iliad. Forging ahead, Schliemann continued to aim straight for the bottom of the mound, haphazardly uncovering ancient stone walls and collecting pottery and other artifacts along the way.
What Schliemann did was to go down deep into this complex site, and he did try to understand how the layers had built up one on top of another. And he wasn't bad at it either. He was quite observant. Of course, now we would do it in much finer detail than he did, but he was the one to reveal that this sort of thing could be done in a site of this sort.
In the third season of digging, the hard work finally paid off. Near the bottom of the mound, workmen uncovered the charred ruins of a citadel. It didn't look like much, but Schliemann declared that it must be the palace of King Priam, burned in the Trojan War. As he himself told the story, he dismissed his workmen and began to attack the palace walls himself.
I cut out the treasure with a large knife, which it was impossible to do without the most fearful risk of my life. But I never thought of any danger. It would, however, have been impossible for me to have removed the treasure without the help of my dear wife, who stood by me ready to pack the things which I cut out in her shawl and carry them away.
It was a fabulous find. Ancient silver and copper vessels, bronze weapons, and most extraordinary of all, elaborate gold jewelry. With Schliemann's usual panache, he announced that he had uncovered the treasure of Priam and the jewels of Helen of Troy. The photograph of Sophia Schliemann modeling Helen's jewels became one of the most celebrated images of the 19th century. Yet Schliemann's account of the discovery was controversial from the start.
The story is certainly fiction in at least one major element, and that is that Sophie was not there. Sophie had left about 3 weeks earlier, gone back to Athens, and so she was certainly not there packing the stuff in her shawl and carrying them off. The question is, how much else is true?
I think that although Sophie wasn't there, and we know that Schliemann was telling a lie about that, that doesn't necessarily mean that the treasure itself was a hoax. I think, in fact, there are very good signs that it was genuine.
There are discrepancies with regard to where the treasure was found, the day on which it was found, and exactly what was found.
He makes wrong connections. For example, he misremembers exactly where things were found. He associates them with the wrong features and so forth. But I think you also have to consider what he has left us with at the end of the day. And what he has left us with is an enormous volume of material, because he was so energetic and spent so much money and spent so much time at Troy.
A master of 19th century media, Schliemann informed the world of his success. But first, he carefully smuggled his treasures out of Turkey, ignoring his permit's stipulation that all finds belonged to the Turks. The crafty German was triumphant. Convinced that he'd uncovered Homer's Troy, buried in myth for more than 3,000 years. Being Schliemann, however, even fame and recognition couldn't occupy him for long. Homer pointed him in a new direction, to a city rich in gold. He turned his sights to Mycenae, home of Agamemnon, leader of the Greeks. Unlike Troy, the city had never been lost. Its picturesque ruins still dominated a hill in Greece, not far from the Aegean Sea. Hungry for gold, Schliemann began to dig in August 1876. Within a few weeks, he discovered evidence of a sacred site. The man's luck seemed unbelievable. Pressing on, he unearthed a series of royal graves, filled with treasures and skeletons adorned with gold. Leaping to conclusions yet again, Schliemann declared that he had discovered the golden mask of Agamemnon. As it turned out, later archaeologists decided it wasn't the mythical king, but it didn't really matter. Schliemann had uncovered evidence of a rich and sophisticated civilization, which had flourished 1,000 years before the days of classical Greece. The objects he'd unearthed were elegant and skillfully crafted. He'd even found a helmet made of boar's teeth that matched Homer's description. Schliemann's fabulous discovery at Mycenae brought him international fame, even the respect of many of his critics. Throughout the next decade, he dug at other Greek citadels, accumulating evidence of the wealth and splendor of this previously unknown civilization. But Schliemann wasn't satisfied. In his heart, he knew his new discoveries cast doubt on the primitive treasures he'd found at Troy. How could he be sure that the walls he'd uncovered deep beneath that mound were the same ones that kept Agamemnon's forces at bay? That down those broken streets, Helen once walked. It was time to return to Troy and make sense of that perplexing mound once and for all. This time, Schliemann proceeded slowly and cautiously, digging in a new spot on the edge of the mound. And bit by bit, the old treasure hunter uncovered a layer in the middle that he'd missed on his earlier digs. Here finally was what he'd been searching for all along: the ruins of broad streets, massive walls, and a much bigger citadel. Schliemann should have been thrilled, but instead his heart sank.
It meant there was a lot of rethinking to do. And in a sense, he saw before his eyes 20 years of work just going down the drain.
For 4 days, Schliemann retreated to his tent, searching for answers. From the beginning, he'd assumed that Homer's Troy lay at the bottom of the mound. Now his new discovery changed everything. If he'd finally found the Troy of the Trojan War in this middle layer, then 20 years ago, he'd made a tragic mistake. For in his haste to dig to the bottom, he'd destroyed much of what he'd been looking for. He'd never know what treasures had been lost. Exhausted, Schliemann vowed to continue the following season. But it was not to be. Suffering from a terrible pain in his ear, he traveled to Germany for surgery, then headed home to Greece. He never got there. Buried in Athens with a state funeral, Schliemann was mourned even by his critics. For 20 years, he'd lit up the world of early archaeology with his drive and enthusiasm. Pursuing his childhood dreams of ancient Greek heroes to the end, he'd pushed back the frontiers of European history. In the process, he put the young science of archaeology on the map. Among the many he inspired was a brilliant young man named Arthur Evans, who visited Schliemann several years before his death. Reaching beyond Schliemann's discoveries, the intrepid Englishman would also track down a legend into the far corners of Europe's hidden past. He would reawaken an even older civilization, buried in myth and oblivion for more than 3,000 years.